I want to touch.
But it's just wild.
Okay, sure. Yep. Okay.
That's frightening.
That is very much so.
Oh, really? Okay.
Thanks, Gretchen.
Okay, we're going to get started. Luckily for me, I have to leave on time today. I'm proud to say my son is graduating from the University of Connecticut. Thank you. 5 years, no more checks. I'm very appreciative. But there's so obviously a lot of other issues surrounding this, and whether it's the danger that I think both of these guys downplayed, if you knew more of the history of how violent Boston was back in this time period. When Victor says that he didn't want to be down at the waterfront at 2 a.m., he would have likely stumbled over a number of other bodies at the waterfront in Boston during that time period. But there's also a lot of other issues with respect to whether it's job risks or they're both lawyers and licensed lawyers, so there are ethical issues involved with respect to, again, the status quo creates these rules to try and ensure that we can't go outside established channels when we desire to get justice for our clients who truly deserve it. So at some point you also risk the forfeiture of your law license. Victor will tell you that on numerous occasions he has been subject as a result of this to IRS audits as well. No one wants to hear from the IRS either. But I've asked Professor Rudnick to join us. Professor Rudnick teaches legal ethics here. She also serves on the Board of Bar Overseers. So I thought that she would bring a different perspective for you all to think a little bit about as well. And she has a couple of questions to ask our panelists as well. Professor Rudnick?
Thank you. Served on the Board of Bar Overseers. Now I sit on the Rules Committee, and we recommend what the rules should be to the SJC, who ultimately enacts them. And that's what governs the conduct of lawyers in all of their both professional and personal lives. And I really hate to be the wet blanket here, but
it's her role.
But that's what I do. And I really have there are two issues really that arise, and one is that there are rules that prohibit lawyers from using the press in a way to influence potential jurors. And that's not what happened here. This was not a jury trial. They were not trying to change the minds of potential jurors. And that's really what the trial publicity rule is designed to curtail or at least control. But I think, having been a criminal defense lawyer for many, many years and having had some high-profile cases, Mr. Garo was very lucky that he found a very sympathetic ear in Mr. Ray, and that he was able to move forward his cause. And I guess what I want to ask is, in general, most criminal defense lawyers don't, especially high-profile criminal defense lawyers, don't think that they're helped by the press. That's been my personal experience from many years ago. So how do you decide what cases you would want to get involved in, and how do you decide when you've got something that may in fact have a trial coming up, how do you decide whether this is something that you want to take, understanding that there are rules about having press conferences? You'd think there weren't, but there are.
Can I go first? I wish you had given that same statement to the district attorney's office back in 1967 when Joe Salvati was arrested on October 25th of 1967. And I wish that several times throughout the case of monumental proportions of pretrial publicity. When I got involved in this case, I told you, ladies and gentlemen, that I do a great amount of thorough research. I went and got the old, some of you will not know this word, microfiche, which was the way that things were kept before you were born. And I went back and searched for years and spent hours, days, and sometimes weeks in researching what was said about my client when he was arrested on October 25th of 1967 and for the upcoming months. And it was always that Joe Salvati was a member of organized crime. He knew all these gentlemen. He's as guilty as everybody else. And this was prior to at the time of arrest and also at the time of trial. And at the time of trial, which was very interesting, that they only had armed guards outside the courtroom as the jurors were coming in, and they had rifles in their hands. There's nothing serious about that. And then when the jury was going to take the case out, they were lined on the inside with machine guns because, see, they wanted to protect poor Mr. Barboza from killers like my client. And it's very, very interesting how the ethic rules come to people like myself who defend, but aren't applied by those in power to the prosecutors. And they're the ones that take advantage of that rule, not defense lawyers, because as you just said, defense lawyers don't use publicity, but the government lives on publicity. And we've seen that in many times when people want to get reputations and they give out a lot of stories. Sometimes they're true, and yet sometimes they're false. Now, the reason why I wanted, and I sought publicity in this case, and you're absolutely right, defense lawyers don't like publicity, is because I had already seen the evidence, had looked it over, and I had already found in my way that my client was completely innocent. So, and when I had Governor Weld saying that my client commutation was being dismissed and denied because of his long and involved criminal record, gee, you think that would have anything to do about ethics? And I said, I have to get someone to speak on our behalf. And that's when the good Lord brought me to Dean Ron Cass, who was a good friend, and Dan was probably one of my is one of my best friends today, if not my best friend. And what's happening is that you cannot make statements that will inflame the potential jury pool. Well, all of this period of time that I'm going on, we didn't have any jury pool. I'm still fighting a case that hasn't even been overturned yet. So am I trying to influence anyway? No, I'm trying to bring out truth. Everything that Dan and I did was based upon evidence that we had. It wasn't me saying, those guys, they're corrupt. Everything that I've ever said in this case, and in the press, who I still have a wonderful relationship today, that they have always said, you always back up with what you said with documentation and for people to go and look. So that it could never be said, because you don't think I was mindful of the fact that the government would like to say Garo's going too far? And you know something? I would have loved them to have said that, because I'd have loved to take them on in a public forum on that.
Actually, the current rules, I don't know what they were back in the 60s or even the 70s, but the current rules are different for prosecutors than they are for the defense bar. The defense bar is governed by a trial publicity rule. Prosecutors are governed by a rule that says, except for statements that are necessary to inform the public of the nature and extent of the prosecutor's action and that serve a legitimate law enforcement purpose, refrain from making, they must refrain from making extrajudicial comments that have a substantial likelihood of heightening public condemnation of the accused.
Can you tell me what date that was published?
Well, this was 99, probably. 97, I don't know which part of this, but this is 97, 98,
I can say this to you, in 1967, that wasn't
No,
the
I'm
law.
sure it wasn't, but these rules are honored in that in Massachusetts, there are virtually no prosecutions against anybody. Massachusetts rarely goes against prosecutors for much.
That's right.
But even the trial publicity rule, which wouldn't have applied to you, I don't think, because you weren't, you didn't have a trial impending, or even under investigation. That rule is not the subject of much either disciplinary or sanction within a trial situation. So there are rules, they are not terribly well enforced, but it doesn't take away from the fact that what you said, as I said, in my experience, is if you have a client who looks guilty from the information that's out there, very frequently, the press jumps on it, and the guy gets convicted before you walk into a courtroom. And I had a number of child rape cases in the 80s when the Boleros had the Fells Acres case.
Yes.
And the press was not a helpful arm for defense attorneys at the time. So maybe, Dan, you could talk about the responsibility of the press and how you would decide if you thought it was something that you would want to get involved in. And
Well, first of all, remember, I have the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law. And in addition, I wasn't there, and if I had been, she looked over 18. No,
I'm your lawyer. Don't say anything else.
that used to be one of the jokes in the newsroom, okay? I wasn't there, she looked over 18. I just would be curious, Professor Rudnick, how you would characterize this letter that Ralph Martin, who was the prosecutor in Suffolk, the district attorney in Suffolk County, do you think that he went beyond the bounds of discretion when he wrote, "I have never criticized and have indeed always encouraged any questions that are designed to elicit or clarify the truth. However, Mr. Ray's questions ignored the facts," which of course we now know is untrue, "and appeared designed to advance his previously demonstrated personal belief that Joseph Salvati is innocent." So I assume that if you assume someone is innocent, you cannot advance that. "In my opinion, such questions impede rather than aid the truth-finding process and prevent disclosure of information that will responsibly and accurately inform the public." This was a letter written by a district attorney, which essentially, if you read between the lines, was a suggestion to my news director, my boss, that at a minimum I be taken off the story, and perhaps even beyond that, lose my job. Would you comment on the ethics of Ralph Martin?
I wasn't there, and he looked over 18.
Let me ask you, what would your advice be to our students, to our graduates? Because to an outsider, it almost looks like the perfect pairing of a skilled advocate with another skilled advocate who uses his pulpit to really try and do justice. And that is...
Can I just add one thing which is really important? And for those of you in this audience, the government in this case ran false witnesses before me and before Victor in an effort to have me put on television one witness that could be shown to have been untrue. And when D. Wilson, I mentioned earlier, the husband of Mr. Wilson, Clay Wilson, who was murdered by Joe Barboza, when she saw a CBS Evening News report in advance of Victor's argument in Superior Court in this case, CBS News basically took my work product and did an Eye in America piece in February of 1995, before Victor went to the state Supreme Court. That night, a couple of hours after the report aired on the West Coast, D. Wilson called me. And when I picked up the phone, it was about 11 o'clock at night our time, she said to me, "I'm trying to reach Dan Rather." I said, "Well, this is Dan Ray." "Well, what about Connie Chung?" And I said, "Well, she's with Dan Rather." And I thought she was over 18. No, only kidding. She said,
Can I give you my card now?
Mrs. Wilson, D. Wilson, said, "Look, that was when we found out that Barboza had told her that he was Joe Barboza, and he showed her his press clippings." I basically said, "Thank you very much," turned her name over to Victor. And I waited 2 or 3 months, and I called her back, and I said, "Mrs. Wilson, do you keep your phone bills from, and she said, "Well, yeah, for a few months." I said, "Do you have your phone bill from the time you called me in February?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, could you send me a copy of that?" And she said, sure, but why would you want that? I said, well, you told me that night that you had called CBS News in New York several occasions, that you called the Boston Police Department here in Boston. I wanted to make sure that she had actually made those phone calls before she called me. That was my due diligence as a reporter, because they had run phony witnesses before us. Which,
Really?
well, you know exactly who those phony witnesses were.
Really?
Which Victor and I had to eliminate. So not only were the prosecutors being unethical and looking to have me fired, but they were also trying to, and this was the FBI, by the way, who was running these phony witnesses. They wanted to destroy that case by sending some people to us who said they had information about the case, but we knew that that information was inaccurate. And as a matter of fact, we excluded some witnesses who ultimately we found out were accurate, because the day that Bill Weld commuted Joe Salvati's sentence, he and I walked out of the State House together, and I said, look, Bill, I just want you to know one thing. What you did today was the right thing to do. And Weld looked at me and says, yeah, I know it was the right thing to do, but why didn't you use, and he mentioned a witness named Tony. I said, we weren't sure of his bona fides. He said he was also helpful. So anyway.
Bill Weld had also served for many years in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston prior to becoming governor, so he would have had some additional insight into some of these issues that these guys had worked so hard at as well.
When he put his mind to it, not initially. He had no interest in it.
Also, but I'd like to mention one other thing. The day I argued the case before the Supreme Court, outside the Supreme Court, there's a big rotunda area, and all the press was there, and there was literally hundreds of people in a space that's really meant for about 60 or 70, and cameras were every place and microphones, and I got very much accused that day of the district attorney said to the press that what Mr. Garo is trying to do is to rewrite history. Duh. When you appeal, that's what you're doing. You are rewriting history. Duh. And so I guess, see, I was accused of rewriting history. I guess I did rewrite history, huh? So I guess it worked out okay. But, you know, Professor, there's one thing that we as criminal defense lawyers all talk about. And where is it when the government does something wrong that no one goes against prosecutors? And the reason I say that is because I testified before Congress. Listen to, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to say to you. I testified before Congress, and they were concerned about the fact that a lot of prosecutors who hid evidence, the exculpatory rule of evidence, that if any evidence can help the defense of a case, it has to be turned over. And this group had done research since 1963 it was, and I was testifying in 2001. And they had found out there was somewhere in the vicinity of over 10,000 cases that were overturned because of lack of exculpatory evidence being handed over to the defense lawyers. Now that includes federal and state. I didn't know the breakdown, but this is a breakdown I can give you. Tell me how many people that you think of those prosecutors were charged with a crime. How about 3? And how about anybody that was found guilty on those 3? None. So in essence, what's happened and is happening is that there's like, as long as I am doing something for the boss in the office, I'm going to be protected. And that no one, listen to me, ladies and gentlemen, I've been on this racket 45 years. No one is doing anything to bring in prosecutors who violate the law. Now watch what happens. Let me just go through that, how it happens. I make a motion for a new trial. I find exculpatory evidence. I then find out that it was in the hands of the police. I then find out that it's in the hands of the prosecutor. I go before the judge. The judge says, Mr. Garo, I agree. That's exculpatory evidence. Too many years have passed. Case dismissed. Thank you very much. What happens to the prosecutor?
Goes back to his office.
What happened to the fact that he violated his code of ethics? What about the oath that he took about doing justice? What happened with the judge that knows what has happened and the judges don't do anything? In other words, when I file a motion for a new trial and the evidence then comes out and it shows that I'm right, the judge says, case dismissed, next case. They don't go and say to the board, I think you should go and look at this fellow. So what I'm saying is, it's nice that the rules are in the book. But ladies and gentlemen, if they're not enforced, they're not worth a hill of beans. And what's happening here in Massachusetts and around the country, and not to the honest prosecutors. Look, I dealt for years with so many prosecutors, federal and state, that are my good friends still to this day. But there are those few that spoil the barrel. And what's happening is no one goes after them. So we can make all the laws we want, but if we don't have a way of enforcing them, it doesn't mean a hill of beans.
There are some investigations that have gone on and are going on at the board.
The one that I'd just like to mention is Mark Wolf, the chief judge of the district here. He has actually gone after one assistant U.S. attorney, and the Justice Department has defended that U.S. attorney. And Judge Wolf, who is a wonderful jurist, he and Nancy Gertner, I think, are the two best lawyers in the circuit. Certainly one would be considered a defense lawyer's type judge, Nancy Gertner, and Mark Wolf, I think, is considered sort of a prosecutor's judge. But they're both interested in justice. They're coming at it from different perspectives. And Mark Wolf has been very frustrated by the Department of Justice. When I talked about the FBI here in Boston, as soon as this case really got hot, who did the FBI bring in as the new special agent in charge of the Boston office? A guy named Charles Prouty. You don't know Charles Prouty, very accomplished attorney, graduate of Virginia Law School, University of Virginia, but in the Office of Professional Responsibility, he had whitewashed everything that John Conley did here. So as opposed to bringing in somebody who could look at the situation in the Boston office of the FBI with clear eyes and clean hands, that didn't happen. So
I think those people who know about discipline in the federal courthouse are pretty much aware that the Office of Professional Responsibility doesn't do very much policing of its own. Although the federal prosecutors and federal lawyers are bound by the rules of the jurisdiction in which they practice law, the federal courts have their own, the federal lawyers have their own office, justice has its own office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, where complaints go. Doesn't mean they can't go to the BBO, but generally they go first, and my limited experience with them is that the Office of Professional Responsibility does not take an aggressive posture with respect to federal prosecutors who make mistakes. And there are a lot. But if I'm not mistaken, the Supreme Court just maybe a week or so ago exonerated a prosecutor exonerated an elected official where an underling had withheld exculpatory evidence. I think it was on a damage case in Thomas' opinion. Am I right, Mr. Garo?
Yep.
So, when you get, at some point, the courts may have to get involved and actually hold people responsible, and we don't appear to have a court system that's willing to do it, whether it's for personal discipline, reversal of a conviction, or in civil case for damages. So prosecutors do get protected, and they have immunity for civil damages, except under very, very, very limited circumstances. So whatever they do, the ramifications are not generally going to come back to them personally.
Dan, you had said earlier that you thought that this case really ran along parallel railroad tracks, and you wanted to get back to that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if this microphone is still on. Can you guys hear me back there? Okay, fine. I wasn't hearing the feedback. If you think about the Salvati case, you have to understand that it's a continuum of prosecutorial and administrative abuse by the FBI that goes back to 1965. Now, it's intertwined with the Bulger-Fleming case as well. And let me just explain it to you real quickly. If you think about this case as conceptually as three parallel railroad tracks, and on one railroad track running from 1965 to the year, whatever year you want to pick, 1995 when Whitey went away, or 1997 when Judge Wolf, by his brilliant conduct in the courtroom, was able to show to Materano and Salemi and other members who were on trial that Stephen Fleming had played them for a fool all those years. So if you have on one track a continuum of informants that begin with Joe Barboza and with Vincent Fleming, and then morph into Stevie Fleming and Whitey Bulger. And then if you have another track of corrupt FBI agents that begin with Paul Rico and Dennis Condon, who flipped Barboza, and morph into other corrupt FBI agents like John Conley and John Morris and others who have never quite been named. If you then have the third parallel track, people who are victims of this perfidious relationship between the informants and the FBI agents, and those victims include obviously Joe Salvati and the men who he went to prison with, as well as their families, as well as the people who were dug up, buried on Tinian Beach by Whitey Bulger and Stephen Fleming. So if you stand aside of those three railroad spurs and just pick a year, 1965, 1970, 1975, 1980, whatever, I can tell you who were the corrupt FBI agents at that time, which informants were those corrupt FBI agents using, and who were being victimized. And it is a continuum. The FBI office in Boston was a organized crime headquarters from 1965 to 1995. That doesn't mean everybody in the office was corrupt, but the people who were running that office either did not know what was going on, therefore they were incompetent, or they knew what was going on, and they were as culpable as the John Morrises, the John Conleys, the Paul Ricos, and the Dennis Condons. So that means for 30 years, folks, for 30 years here in beautiful Massachusetts, where we think we're really sophisticated people. This wasn't Mississippi in the 40s or the 50s. This was, which we know a lot of stuff went on down there, and small-town law officials, turned their way when someone was hung or intimidated for trying to assert their civil rights. It was different up here. Up here, it was the FBI, along with their corrupt informants, who were basically running amok for 30 years here in Boston.
Victor.
As I said, in doing thorough research, usually if you're doing something criminally wrong, you have to keep the same people in the same position for periods of time, or else it can go awry. And so length of time is very important. So what I did is I checked back and I went through all the special agents in charge of the Boston office of the FBI from about the late 1957 up till about 2001, when I was going to testify before Congress. And let me just read, I won't give you the names to protect the innocent, but I would like to
I might.
to the number of years. 4 years, 1 year, 1 year, 9.5 years, 2 years, 3 years, 2 years, 2 years, 3.5, 3, 3.5, 3, 3, and the last one 2.5. But one was for 9.5 years. When do you think that those years of that person and special agent in charge of the Boston office that he served from? How about if I say to you from January of 1964 to February of 1973, all the period of time that all this chicanery was going on, they kept the same people in there. And then when J. Edgar Hoover passed away, then he went on to another place. So just looking at the years, it would be, when I did it and I showed it to Dan, says, "You're kidding." And he said, where'd you find this? You know, he helped me with it. So I said, no, we found out it was 9.5 years. So they wanted to have that continuing saga that I can protect everybody who was involved during this period of time. And that's how deep and how wide this whole conspiracy is. And, you know, to this day, we need these people to help us. So I'm not saying everybody is corrupt, neither is Dan. But there are some in there that believe that they know better, and they know what evidence should come forward, and they know who should get arrested and who should die. And one last thing I want to say, and I'll let you go deep, is this, that, listen to this. When Joe Salvati got indicted on October 25th of 1967, when you were charged with murder in the first degree, at that time, the punishment back in those days was death in the electric chair for a first-degree murder prosecution and conviction. And the only way that you could avoid that if the jury was to come back and recommend leniency. If the jury recommended leniency, you would not die in the electric chair, you would get life imprisonment. So if we take the words that Judge Nancy Gertner wrote, and we take the decision by the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and we put this all together, it was an intentional act on behalf of the federal government to kill Joe Salvati by having him die in the electric chair on evidence that they fabricated. You think of that sometime. They wanted him to die in the electric chair, and they knew it. All the evidence that I presented at trial, and for all the years that Dan and I got, they knew that he was innocent. And it wasn't just one person, it was the entire hierarchy, as Judge Gertner said. So there's more than 5, 10, 15, 20 people that knew that this man was innocent, and they wanted him to die like an animal. Just remember that sometime when you say, we do have a good government, but we sure need watchdogs out there. And I hope that some of you, when you go out into your professional life, be that watchguard, be that watchdog, and be that guardian of justice. We need you desperately.
I want to have you look at the statement of Ron Cass, who was the dean of Boston University at the time and is now the dean emeritus there, because I have a question, but I want you to hear his words because I think they're very important, especially for future law students. It says, lawyers have the honor to be part of a profession that has guardianship of the rule of law. When we do what we should, we protect the innocent, curb the power of the state, and promote the rule of law. Much of what lawyers do fits that mold. Few lawyers and few judges, however, act as selflessly, give of themselves as generously, or stand up for what is right as boldly as our honorees who are with us here today, Dan Ray and Victor Garo, and Judge Gertner, who will be with us Saturday night. This was an incredibly difficult fight at great personal sacrifice. And I'm wondering who else shared that journey with you along the way, because in some of these cases we know that there really are few, what they call where I come from, stand-up guys that you two obviously have done over the course of representing your clients here. Who else really stood up when they could have just simply turned their backs and walked away, or said, you know, Victor, Dan, you might be right, but it's not my fight?
Well, I'll tell you who one of the people is. It's Chief Judge Mark Wolf of the Federal District Court, who took on the entire federal government for 1 year and found that Whitey Bulger and Stevie Fleming were informants for the FBI. He didn't cower behind that, and there was plenty of pressure put on him. Judge Nancy Gertner, who was the trial judge, there was much pressure placed on her in this case because with the award that she gave, she broke all the records around the country and around the world, and the federal government knew what that was. But I would like to say, if I could, you talk about stand-up people, and I'll talk about this tomorrow night, but some of your students and people might not be here tomorrow night. If I may, I'd just like to go into this, because it's a personal story to me, and it's very personal, and Dan was part of it. And I got to tell you about my folks, because they were the greatest influence in my life. My mother grew up as an orphan. She was orphan at age about 3.5. And my father was born to abject poverty. My father had to leave school in the 10th grade because he had to make some money for the family. And my mother had a terrible, tough upbringing, went from house to house to house to house. My mother was Irish, my father was Italian. Somehow they found each other later in life. They fell in love and got married. And in stories that my mom and dad told me, God rest their souls, that said to me that we decided that we wanted to give you and your sister an education that we didn't get because education is so important in life. My father worked as a waiter in the Statler Hotel in Boston, and he rose himself up to a couple other positions, but he worked every single day. My mother at that time was a stay-at-home mom and watched over my sister and myself. And they saved enough money so I could go on to college and on to law school. Well, I was in the military back in 1965. I was lucky enough to pass the bar exam the first time, and I got a 36-hour leave from Fort Dix, New Jersey, because that's where I was, and I came to Boston, and I got sworn in as a lawyer in the Supreme Court. It was a very exciting day for my mom and dad, and we went across the street to have dinner, luncheon at a place called Dinny's. Maybe not everybody remembers that place, but he was a Medford gentleman, and my mom and dad brought me over there, and he saw my father. He says, "Joe, what are you doing?" He said, "Oh, my son." Oh, sent over a nice bottle of wine. It was a very nice afternoon. But then I noticed that my mom and dad got kind of quiet. And I said, "Folks, have I done something to you? Are you upset with me?" They said, No, son. We're just so proud of you." I said, "No, forget it. I'm proud of you. You worked so hard to give me this education that you wanted me to have." And I said, "But something's going on." And my father said, "Well, yes. Mommy and I want to give you a statement and give you some advice. It's the only advice that we're going to give you unless you ask for our advice into the future." And I said, "Sure." And this was the advice that my mother and father gave me. They said, "Son, now that you're a lawyer, you can go out and help people. We want you to go and help people. Don't do it just for the money. The money will come. But you're going to be in such a wonderful position. Please go out and help people." And I said to my mom and dad, I said, "It's that important to you, isn't it?" They said, "Yes, it is." Now I'd like to go forward. I went on my own in 1973. I was with a firm for 7 years in Medford, Zamparelli and White. And my father and my mother were there all along the road with me. I went on my own in 73. And I had asked my mother, because I'm a one-man law office with one secretary. I've had the same secretary for 34 years. So it's me against the whole federal government, Dan, and my secretary. And so I asked my mom, I says, I'm a bachelor, still am, and I used to, the only way you can exist as a single-person law firm is to give 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365 days a week that you're available. So I lived at home with my mom and dad, so I said, "Mom, would you like to become my home secretary?" She says, "Oh, I would love that." And I says, "I'm going to pay you." "No, you don't have to pay me." No, Mom, I'm going to pay you." So I had something made that it says K. Garo, Home Secretary, and we put this right by the phone, and I still have it there to this day. And so my mother had talked to Joe Salvati hundreds of times over the phones because in certain prisons he was in, he could make calls. Yeah, collect calls to me. So I said, "Sure, you can call." So my mother had never met him, but my mother had talked to him, and she heard Dad and I talk about the case all the time. And so my mother in the mid-'80s started to get very sickly, and she was going to die. And so she died in '88. And I believe it was about maybe 3 or 4 months before she passed away. My dad used to take care of her during the day, and I would watch over her at night. And she would wait for me to come home at about 7:30, 8 o'clock, and I always bring her some hot chocolate, or I'd make her some tea, and I'd bring some cupcakes, or some cookies, or some ice cream, and she would love that. And so she said to me this one night, she says, "Victor," she says, "I listen to you and Dad talking all the time." I says, "Yes, Mom." "About Joe Salvati?" "Yes." And she says, "I believe he's innocent just like you and Dad do." And she says, "I want you to make me a promise." And I said, "What's that, Mom?" She says, I want you to make me a promise that you will stay with Joe Salvati until you walk him out of prison. I said, Mommy, it means that much to you? She says, will you, because no one's going to spend all this time, and no one will ever do this other than you. So will you promise me? So I got up, I hugged her, and I kissed her, and I said, I promise you. Now, spring forward, she passes away in '88, and we go to the day of March 20th of 1997. On that day, that's the day that Joe Salvati walked out of prison. And my father was with me. He was still alive. He didn't pass away till '98. And the PR person for the Department of Corrections found out about my promise to my mother, and it was an amazing thing what the Department of Corrections did, that the main entrance to the prison was closed for about 8 or 10 minutes so that I could walk out of prison with Joe Salvati and hand him over to his to his family. Well, now, my mother had never met Joe Salvati, and I said that I would do what I did. So we took Joe to the parole person that he was under, and I allowed Dan and his cameraman, who I knew very well as a personal friend, my father, myself, my secretary, and Joe and Marie Salvati, and we went and visited my mother's grave. And I put the red roses. And I said, Mama, I kept my promise. Here's Joe Salvati. Now, see, the government doesn't want you to hear, and I still choke up when I talk about it, because it's personal. They don't want you to think about the personal tragedies or the personal problems that all of us had to go through. This was not easy. But I kept my promise to my mother. And in the end, ladies and gentlemen, your reputation is all you have. My father said to me, and I'll close it with this, my father said to me, son, there's one thing that money can't buy. And I said, what's that, Dad? He says, it's your reputation. You earn it every single day of your life. He says, you remember that. So that's what I've done.
Victor had told me that at one point he had put in over, I think it's 20,000 hours.
Over 30,000.
Without any expectation of receiving any payment at all in this case. It was only at some point with the civil case where there was any chance. But he had put in many, many years, many, many hours, many, many nights without any expectation of any compensation whatsoever to try and free Joe Salvati. Dan?
Thank you.
I can't top that story, but I will tell you one story which I think is important to take from this, and that is that when Victor and Joe and Marie testified in front of Congress, it was really gratifying as a reporter to be there at the Government Reform Committee. They had I'm going to say 25, 27 members, Democrats, Republicans, Liberals, Conservatives from all across the country, rural, farm states, urban areas, and it became very evident with all the testimony. F. Lee Bailey testified because he had represented some of these men way back in the 1960s and 70s on appeal. It was quite a show, and the two members of Congress who I want to just identify, because I know it's easy for us to knock all politicians. There's two who deserve special recognition. One is Congressman Dan Burton. He's a conservative Republican from Indiana, and J. Edgar Hoover had been his personal hero as a boy. But once Burton heard what had gone on, because Hoover knew what was going on up here in Boston, and that was part of the evidence that was unearthed in a grand jury that led to the conclusion, the conclusion that Salvati and these guys were innocent. And the other was John Lewis, who's a congressman from Atlanta. He marched with Dr. King at Selma, and he would be a very liberal Democrat and the conservative Republican. And they went ahead and they filed legislation after they knew this whole story to take J. Edgar Hoover's name off the FBI building in Washington.
It didn't pass, though.
No, it didn't pass.
No, what it shows is the tremendous inertia that exists, and that our government so often is not willing to do the right thing. But there are individuals down there, and I cite Burton and Lewis as two, who on this issue absolutely wanted to do the right thing. And after all this evidence, Hoover's name to this day still remains on the FBI building in Washington, D.C. And J. Edgar Hoover was one of the most corrupt public officials in the history of this country. He exercised broad and extraordinary powers, not only over members of Congress, but over presidents of the United States. He maintained information on the personal habits of major politicians in this country and was able to hang that over their head. At the same time, he carried on a very bizarre relationship with his assistant director and his roommate, his very special friend, Clyde Tolson. And that's not to suggest that the fact that he and Tolson, had an odd relationship or a different relationship, a relationship that today probably would be celebrated, but yet the hypocrisy that he had information over presidents, over senators, over members of Congress, and yet his name still remains on that FBI building in Washington, D.C., which just shows that when you go against the government, all the odds are on the side of the government, unfortunately. Someday, maybe, someday, J. Edgar Hoover's name will come off that building. I wish, because of what he did to Dr. King, when he wiretapped Dr. King's phone in the 1960s, and what he did to Joe Salvati and these other men, that his name would be off there now. But it's still there. So there's still work to be done, ladies and gentlemen. And we hope some of you will carry on the mission.
You've heard four words repeatedly today, and I think if I was going to sum up, whether it's a press issue or whatever, that what I would hope you would go out and do as lawyers, and that is do the right thing. You know what it is, do it.
Thank you, Connie. I have one last question, and then Victor has a last piece that he just wanted to read to you. But in this incredible tale of corruption and abuse of power, at the end of the day, is it a story that the system works? As odd as that seems.
Sometimes justice delayed is justice denied, but at the same time, we have, I don't know if I can call it justice, because you took 30 years out of a man's life, his children's lives, the wife's lives, their marriage life, but did it come to light of the wrong they did? Yes, it has. Has it put them in disgrace? Yes, it have. But at the same time, on the other 49 other states, they don't know anything that's going on over here in Massachusetts. And that's the really troubling part about this, is because there's been a blanket of knowledge about this case around the country.
Dan?
Yeah, I think Joe Salvati said to me that, hey, we still have the best system of justice in the world. And it's true. We do have the best system of justice in the world. We have a very aggressive defense bar. All of you have seen the Project Innocent individuals who have been proven always by DNA to have been innocent, and I think that it's about 2% of the cases that come to them, or 3% of the cases that come to them, that prove that people have been incarcerated wrongfully because of DNA. So I think if you project that figure of 3% of wrongful convictions in DNA cases, I suspect that there are 3% at least of prison inmates in this country today who have been wrongfully incarcerated. It's not systemic like it is in other countries where they can kill you in the streets or put you in a gulag in the old Soviet Union. But there are individuals who can rig the system, like Paul Rico did, and like Dennis Conda did, and like John Conley did, and John Morris did, for their own personal benefit, and obviously do tremendous harm to individuals. But if you do, there are no Nancy Gertners in a lot of these countries around the world, and the Victor Garos in these countries around the world, whether it's Cuba, North Korea, wherever, they're in jail. So as long as Victor still is out of jail, and as long as we have judges like Nancy Gertner and Mark Wolf, it is a great system, and it's a system that all of you are going to be involved in. It's, as I forget who it was, you know, that might have been Winston Churchill, might have been Mark Twain that said, you know, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And maybe our system of justice is the worst form of, worst system of justice in the world except for all the others. So it's not perfect. And you guys need to make sure that, that it gets as close to being perfect as possible.
We're going to close this segment with the piece that Victor wants to read. We'll then get some lunch, and we'll continue some questions. Professor Sullivan will come up on the podium as well to try to field some of your questions with our guests as well as we have lunch. So, Victor?
Thank you. I will be here for as long as you people have asked questions. And I love speaking to law school students. I remember back in the day that I would be enthralled if people would come and speak to me about some of their achievements that they had done and how hard they worked, because it gave me the impetus to wanting to go forward and do the same thing. So I hope that's helped you, all of you, somewhat. What I like to do is to read you. When I go around the country and I speak, I talk about what I believe in and how I have formulated my life, and how I won't quit, and I won't give up, and I persevere. I do a lot of research. I do a lot of things that people don't understand unless you're in the business. And I want to read you something. It's by Anonymous, and it's something when I go around the country, I have bookmarks, and they're here. I have about 75 of them here, and you're welcome to take it if you want. And it's what I believe in. It's how I've lived my life. It's how I live my professional life. And this is what it's called. It says, don't quit. When things go wrong, as they sometimes will, when the road you're trudging seems all uphill, when the funds are low and the debts are high, and you want to smile, but you have to sigh, when care is pressing you down a bit, rest if you must, but don't you quit. Life is strange with its twists and turns, as every one of us sometimes learns. And many a person turns about when they might have won had they stuck it out. Don't give up, though the pace seems slow. You may succeed with another blow. Often the struggler has given up when he might have captured the victor's cup, and he learned too late when the night came down how close he was to the golden crown. Success is failure turned inside out. So stick to the fight when you're hardest hit. It's when things seem worst that you mustn't quit. God bless you and good luck in your education. Oh, yeah, we're all close. Oh, sure. I know Richard very well. I tried when he was a prosecutor.
Thank you very much. I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes, take one if you